Boa tarde. Nós vamos dar início à segunda mesa desse seminário, intitulada As Relações Sul-Sul na Multipolaridade. Eu queria, em primeiro lugar, parabenizar as organizadoras do seminário, a professora Maria Regina, Mônica Hirst, a professora Letícia Pinheiro. Agradecer o convite, pedir desculpas em nome da professora Maria Hermínia. Infelizmente, teve que viajar para Washington essa semana e não pôde comparecer. Mas pediu desculpas e, em nome dela, eu também agradeço o convite. O professor Luiz Fernandes deve estar chegando, a gente vai já dar início. Nós temos aqui, agora à tarde, o professor Mzukisi Qobo, da University of Pretoria, que é professor da Universidade de Pretoria, pesquisador do Centro de Políticas e Pesquisa, foi diretor do Programa de Potências Emergentes no Instituto Sul-Africano de Assuntos Internacionais, é doutor em Política pela Universidade de Warwick, possui mestrado em Estudos Internacionais pela Universidade de Stellenbosch. Como diretor-chefe do Departamento de Comércio e Indústria, foi responsável pela política comercial da África do Sul. Foi também pesquisador de pós-doutorado na OMC e na Universidade de Stellenbosch. À minha esquerda, nós temos o professor Tridib Chakraborty, da Jadavpur University, que é professor e ex-diretor do Departamento de Relações Internacionais da Universidade de Jadavpur, onde foi também Research Fellow. Professor tem experiência em áreas de política do Sul e Sudeste Asiáticos, relações exteriores, questões estratégicas, diáspora indiana e questões étnicas do Sudeste Asiático. Atualmente trabalha com regionalismo no Sudeste Asiático, ameaças domésticas emergentes no Sudeste Asiático, política externa da Índia para o Sudeste Asiático, Vietnã e política externa chinesa. Tudo bom, professor? E aqui acaba de chegar o professor Luiz Manuel Fernandes, que é mestre e doutor em Ciência Política pelo UPERJ, professor do Instituto de Relações Internacionais da PUC-Rio, foi diretor científico da FAPERJ, secretário executivo do Ministério de Ciência e Tecnologia e presidente da FINEP de 2007 a janeiro deste ano. Foi ainda membro do Conselho de Desenvolvimento Econômico e Social da Presidência da República e diretor da Associação Brasileira de Ciência Política. E, para debater nesta mesa, o professor Ricardo Senes, da Prospectiva Consultoria, diretor da Prospectiva, professor de Relações Internacionais da PUC São Paulo, tem doutorado e mestrado em Ciência Política pela USP, é especialista no cenário econômico e político da América Latina e coordena vários projetos nas áreas de integração financeira e serviços no Mercosul. Foi pesquisador visitante do Centro de Relações Internacionais na USP, do Woodrow Wilson Center, e do Centro Ibérico de Estudos da América Latina na Universidade da Califórnia, em San Diego, e é também o coordenador do Grupo de Análise da Conjuntura Internacional do Instituto de Relações Internacionais da USP. Feitas as apresentações, eu vou imediatamente passar a palavra ao professor Mzukisi.
Thanks, Chair, and I would like to also extend thanks to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this seminar on South-South cooperation. Now, the theme of our panel is South-South cooperation in multipolarity. And all of these concepts are heavily contested. The notion of the South can no longer be taken for granted. It can no longer be viewed in the same way that countries used to talk about the South in the 1950s, the 1960s, and the 1970s. Similarly, it's not clear what we're referring to when we talk about multipolarity. I think speakers earlier on in the previous session tried to interrogate this notion to critique its meaning. I think Marcos Sintra led the charge there. And yeah, I will try to make some sense of what these mean and why they should be important for us. First, I talk about what I consider to be the nature of the global system today, the forces that shape it. And second, in the context of this change, I reflect on some of the impulses that shape developing countries' approach to international affairs. And third, I make some observation about the actual nature of South-South cooperation and whether indeed this is yielding any productive basis from which to reconfigure the coordinates of global governance or lend multipolarity and any substance. As I said, as I indicated earlier on, that South-South cooperation have a very long history that can be traced back in the struggles against colonialism in the 50s through to the early 90s. It was expressed through various initiatives, beginning with the Bandung Conference, the Non-Aligned Movement, and the UNCTAD 77. And in many respects, it took on a very anti-imperialist undertone and sought to shift the balance of power in the international system in favor of developing countries, or the third world as they were at the time famously known. And most of these countries sought to contest terms of trade and the international division of labor that positioned them at the bottom of the production value chain. And they also were intent at improving conditions for economic development. And as you may be well aware, that some of the radical thinkers that lent intellectual substance to those movements came from this region, including Hernando Cardoso, Raul Prebisch, as well as Andre Gunda Frank. It was more on the basis of glaring inequities in the international order that these countries formed solidarity. Now, can we really still say that the international order or the global system is the same as it was when South-South cooperation gained prominence pre-1990? I think that while the basic structure of the global order still exhibit a great deal of imbalances and exclusions and persistent underdevelopment in parts of the global system and affluence in parts of it, much has changed a great deal since the 60s and the 70s. And also the current realities that we contend with are different from the one that obtained for much of the mid to the latter part of the 20th century, when the Cold War was the main signifier of the international system. It has also changed quite significantly from the period in the 1980s when economic determination, or the basic structure of international economic order, was centered around the triad of the EU, the US, and Japan. And it is undeniable that there is global power redistribution. Some say, well, political power remains significantly in the developed North amongst the advanced industrial countries, even though the economic shifts favor the so-called emerging economies, or the rising South. It is widely recognized that the global system will be shaped more along the lines of multipolarity rather than a world where the center of decision-making is directed by a coterie of countries, and that multilateralism will need to be strengthened in order to ensure a proper mediation of plurality. I think the notion of multipolarity is made all the more important on the account of the plurality of voices in the global system, the contestation of the terms of power in making decisions in various multilateral institutions, and the recognition that a set of developing countries are growing in confidence. They are staking their claim as important players in shaping the evolving global governance mechanism. So it's not, in a sense, an empty concept, but I think the confusion arises somewhat in the fact that it is sometimes made to be synonymous with equality, that all countries are therefore equal, or that all countries have equal weight or equal voice. I don't think that we will reach that stage. There are undeniably asymmetries of power, asymmetries of capabilities. The rise of emerging economies do not necessarily erase those structural factors. In fact, I would argue that, in a sense, they accentuate them because it creates another layer of aspirant countries that are, an elite group of countries that's different from the rest of the South, that is different from Africa, and that is different from other excluded countries. However, still, I think the rise of emerging powers such as Brazil, India, and China, and many others have forced us to rethink how best to deal with issues of global governance. I think their very rise casts a sharp spotlight on the changing character of the global system, that, as I indicated, it is no longer just driven by a singular power, a singular voice, or a singular bloc such as the G7. And here, evidence of this is expressed in the creation of the G20 Leaders Summit in the late 2008, in the wake of the global financial crisis. And I think this was a powerful admission of the need to manage the global economy differently. And also this has laid a very strong basis for serious discussions beyond rhetoric about how should we reform a global governance. I think as knowledge community, as academics, scholars, and experts on these issues, I suspect that we have not sufficiently, or rather what we have not done sufficiently in my view, is to take a critical look at South-South cooperation in the light of these global shifts. I think there is a tendency to think that South-South cooperation is the same as as it was back then. It's something that has to be supported from an ideological basis, and that a solidarity and friendship amongst these countries that share similar characteristics and background of having been colonized before is something to be championed. And I think this is an illusion, because the countries cannot be friends the way myself and Garth are friends, or myself and Ricardo are friends. I mean, it's a myth. Countries have a certain level of abstraction that cannot be easily reduced to such personal images. So I think there has to be a certain level of carefulness about how we approach South-South cooperation. And I think in the case of Brazil, I mean, I know very little about Brazil and South Africa. There has been this tendency of championing this notion of multilateralism, projecting an image of being a responsible international citizen, an urge to achieve this global prestige, and to a very ideational and very idealistic expression of interests. I think, for lack of a better word, I would use interest, but At the same time, what is missing is an articulation of these countries' distinct economic interests in various multilateral institutions. So you would find that a lot of diplomatic energy, a lot of diplomatic resources, a lot of time is spent pursuing coalitions, informal meetings, without proper accounting of benefit creation for citizens in these countries. So I think we have not properly interrogated the notion of South-South and contestation of spaces of global governance from the point of view of concrete developmental benefits for these countries. Two, I think also we make too much of the binary tensions between the North and the South. Yes, of course, there are still pockets of poverty and underdevelopment in many countries that used to be called the South, but this image is changing, and I think that it is not too helpful at all times to make this binary distinction, because in any case, if global governance is to have any meaning, and if the global order is to be effectively managed, it will require strong bridge building between the South and the North. In some respects, countries in the South will have differences. They will agree with developed or northern countries, as is the case, for an example, around the question of currency manipulation by China, the tension between Brazil and China, China's growing export footprint in this region, which some suggest undercuts Brazil's export propensity in its own region, or the territorial disputes that obtained between China and India in Asia. The tensions that are in the news constantly between Vietnam and China in South Sea. And also, I mean, the interlocking, sometimes the breaking away of this South-South solidarity to support same positions as those that are championed by the North, as was the case with the use of the UN Security Council resolution as a cover by the Western countries to launch military incursions in Libya, where South Africa voted differently from its BRIC counterparts, or the fact that, for an example, India's bid to secure a seat in the UN Security Council is effectively supported by a northern country, which is the US. Imagine China publicly supporting India for its bid to join the UN Security Council. So at a certain level, and I think in some important respects, this notion of South-South solidarity does not have a very strong grounding. It does not carry as much weight as is sometimes suggested. And also they are interlocking, very strongly interlocking relationships between the South and the North. I mean, the first one, of course, is what in the Western public media has been characterized as the G2 center, which is China and the U.S. interlocking relationship, and a recognition that this is the core center for making important determinations about major decisions affecting the global system, from climate change to finance to issues related to the Security Council. Niall Ferguson characterizes this nicely as chimerica. Now, one of the less remarked about factor in this interlocking relationship is the extent to which sovereign wealth funds from the South, especially from China, Middle East, Russia, and Singapore, perhaps excluding Russia because it does not quite fit the category of the South, are significantly invested in the West, which in my view, prefigures how South conceives of its interests. For an example, these government-controlled commercial entities were directed towards Western financial sector and invested in banks such as Citigroup, Merrill Lynch, Royal Bank of Scotland, Barclays. In the first quarter of 2008, the total value of their investment in Western financial centers was $58 billion US. And apart from Asia, where most of these funds originate, and which captures 31% of them, which is the value of about $58 billion US, the EU leads with $57 billion US, capturing 30% of the transactions. The US, $37 billion US, capturing 20%. Much of this does not express South-South liking or South-South cooperation. It's not monies flowing to favoring southern centers or favoring Africa. They are largely flowing into developed country markets. Perhaps to skip a bit of my notes because I'm running out of time, to quickly talk about South Africa before I conclude. In my view, I think, well, when South Africa, I think, and here Garth, I think, has helped me a lot in his previous presentation because he set the terrain quite nicely. South Africa had this strong notion of being a multilateralist, of being a good international citizen, and of defining a very development agenda in a very broad terms. I mean, I remember I spent, when I was spending some time working at the WTO in Geneva, you see some of these diplomats from Brazil. I mean, Brazil was a lead actor in the whiteboard development agenda, and you are at a loss sometimes to really identify some of the concrete gains that this will generate, and you sometimes get a sense of, this brinkmanship, this show of force, show of, we have arrived, we can, out-negotiate the developed countries. Nothing wrong with that, but I think the priority should always be to demonstrate. There's to be demonstration effect back at home in terms of real development gains. And perhaps to conclude, in conclusion, I think there's nothing wrong with South-South cooperation. This is not the argument that I'm making, but I think, again, to reiterate this point, there needs to be a powerful rationale that underpin this, non-ideological, very pragmatic. And two, I think that countries need to undertake a domestic dialogue type of exercise, which South Africa is currently undertaking, but from a very, there's incoherence to try and evolve what is called in South Africa a new growth path, a new organizing principle to define South Africa's development interests and development objectives. It's incoherent because this is not tightly linked to how the country project itself in global economic relations. I will leave my presentation there. I'll cover other issues, hopefully, during discussion time. Thanks.